October 1944, Philippine Sea. Japanese commanders watched in horror as entire kamikaze squadrons, young pilots who'd written their final letters and embraced certain death, simply vanished in mid-air before reaching American ships, their ultimate sacrifices rendered completely meaningless by explosions that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Within 6 months, this invisible American weapon would slaughter 4,600 suicide pilots who never knew what killed them, turning Japan's most desperate strategy into a technological massacre. But how did a miniature radio crammed into an artillery shell, technology so advanced that Japan couldn't even comprehend it existed, end up deciding who would win the Pacific War before the kamikazes ever took off? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By late 1944, the Empire of Japan was dying. 4 years of war had drained the island nation of nearly everything it needed to fight. At Midway, the Marianas, and Leyte Gulf, America had destroyed the backbone of Japan's navy. Experienced pilots who had trained for years were gone, shot down over distant seas, or lost with their carriers. The young men now climbing into cockpits had maybe 60 hours of flight training, barely enough to take off and land. Meanwhile, American factories were building ships faster than Japan could sink them. Every month, new Essex-class carriers joined the Pacific Fleet, each one larger and more powerful than anything Japan could produce. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Japan was losing, and losing badly. In October 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a desperate solution. If Japan could not win through conventional warfare, it would win through spirit. He created the Special Attack Units, soon known by a more haunting name, Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. The concept was brutally simple. Load a Zero fighter with explosives, aim it at an American ship, and crash directly into the target. No bombs to mess, no need to escape. One plane, one pilot, one ship. It was a mathematical trade that Japan's leaders believed they could win. After all, American anti-aircraft guns only hit 1 or 2% of attacking planes under normal conditions. But kamikazes were not normal attacks. They did not need to drop bombs and turn away. They simply had to reach the target, which meant they had many more chances to succeed. At air bases across Japan and Okinawa, teenage boys prepared for their final flights. Some were 17 years old. They wrote letters to their mothers, telling them not to cry. They wrapped white hachimaki headbands around their heads, symbols of samurai determination. They climbed into bomb-laden Zeros that could barely stay airborne under the weight of explosives. Japanese propaganda told them their deaths would save the homeland, that their sacrifice embodied the true Japanese spirit called Yamato Damashi. They believed that American sailors, soft and individualistic, would break under the psychological horror of suicide attacks. Emperor Hirohito himself had blessed the strategy. For young men raised to worship the emperor as a living god, there was no greater honor than to die at his command. Meanwhile, steaming toward the Philippines, the American fleet carried a secret. In the magazines of the USS Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and dozens of escort carriers sat artillery shells that looked ordinary, but were not. Inside each 5-inch shell, American engineers had packed a complete radio system: a transmitter, a receiver, a battery, and a detonator. These components were so small and so tough that they could survive being fired from a cannon at forces 20,000 times stronger than gravity. The shells were called VT Fuzes, short for variable time, though sailors whispered their real name, proximity fuses. They did not need to hit an airplane directly. They exploded automatically when they sensed a plane nearby, creating clouds of deadly shrapnel 70 feet wide. No gunner in the Japanese military knew this weapon existed. No intelligence report had warned them. When the first kamikaze waves launched at Leyte Gulf, the pilots expected to face the same anti-aircraft fire that had always been survivable if you were brave and lucky. Instead, they flew into an invisible wall of explosions that began killing them while they were still hundreds of feet from their targets. Zeros disintegrated in mid-air. Pilots died without ever understanding what had hit them. Japanese commanders monitoring from distant airfields received confused radio reports in the final seconds before their pilots vanished. Unprecedented accuracy, impossible explosion patterns, something new and terrifying. They had no idea they were facing a revolution in warfare, one that would turn their most desperate strategy into a slaughter. Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara sat in the briefing room at Chiran Air Base in January 1945, listening to his commanding officer describe the next mission. Around him, 24 young pilots shifted nervously in their seats. They had all heard the rumors. Entire squadrons were disappearing. Pilots who should have reached the American fleet were simply vanishing. A few survivors, pulled from the ocean by Japanese submarines, told impossible stories. They said American shells were exploding without hitting anything, creating walls of fire in the sky. The commanders dismissed these reports as lies or hallucinations, cowards inventing excuses for their failure. Real Japanese warriors did not make excuses. But Kuwahara noticed something in his commander's eyes: fear. The officers knew something was wrong, even if they wouldn't admit it. 3 days later, Kuwahara climbed into his Zero and took off with 11 other planes. His aircraft was so heavy with explosives that it barely cleared the runway. The formation flew low over the ocean toward the American carrier fleet near Okinawa. As they approached, Kuwahara could see the gray shapes of ships on the horizon. His heart pounded. This was the moment he had trained for, the moment he would give his life for the Emperor. Then the sky erupted. Black clouds of shrapnel appeared everywhere, not near the ships, but far out, where the kamikazes were still climbing to attack altitude. The plane to his left simply came apart, wings and fuselage separating as if torn by invisible hands. The pilot to his right exploded in a ball of fire. Kuwahara yanked his stick hard, diving and weaving, but the explosions followed him. They were not aimed at where he was, but where he was going to be. It made no sense. He saw the USS Ticonderoga ahead, massive and untouchable behind this wall of death. 2 more planes from his squadron disintegrated. Then his engine coughed and died. Whether from damage or mechanical failure, he never knew. The Zero began falling toward the ocean, and Kuwahara wrestled with the canopy, finally getting it open and tumbling into the cold Pacific water. An American destroyer picked him up 30 minutes later. In the ship's brig, still shivering and wrapped in a blanket, Kuwahara overheard 2 sailors talking. One of them said something that made his blood freeze. The sailor called it the VT secret, a weapon so powerful that even talking about it had been forbidden until recently. The shells exploded by themselves when they got near a plane. No direct hit needed. The American gunners did not even have to aim perfectly anymore. They just had to get close, and the shell did the rest. Kuwahara thought about his friends, the pilots who had written final letters to their families, who had believed their deaths would mean something. They had been slaughtered not by superior American courage, but by superior American technology. In October, kamikaze attacks had succeeded 14 times out of every 100. Now, in early 1945, fewer than 2 out of every 100 kamikazes reached their targets. The proximity fuse had increased American anti-aircraft effectiveness by 300%. Japan was not just losing the war, Japan was fighting an enemy that operated in a completely different technological age, an enemy that could invent weapons Japan could not even imagine. Kuwahara realized with crushing certainty that every kamikaze pilot still flying was already dead, killed not by American ships, but by Japanese leaders who refused to see the truth. The prisoner of war camp at Pearl Harbor looked nothing like what Kuwahara expected. He had been taught that Americans tortured their prisoners, that they were barbarians without honor. Instead, he found himself in a clean barracks with a real bed, 3 meals a day, and guards who mostly ignored him unless he caused trouble. The food alone shocked him. Rice, meat, vegetables, bread, and sometimes even fruit. In Japan, civilians were starving. Soldiers at the front survived on handfuls of rice and whatever they could scavenge. Here, as a prisoner, Kuwahara ate better than he had eaten in 2 years. After 2 weeks of processing, an American intelligence officer visited him. The man spoke some Japanese and carried a folder full of photographs and diagrams. He sat across from Kuwahara at a small table and opened the folder. Inside was a cutaway drawing of an artillery shell with strange components visible inside. The officer began explaining what Kuwahara had experienced in the sky over Okinawa. The proximity fuse, he said, was a miniature radio station packed into the nose of a 5-inch shell. When the shell was fired from a ship's gun, it experienced forces 20,000 times stronger than gravity, enough to crush almost anything. But American engineers had figured out how to make vacuum tubes, the delicate glass components that made radios work, strong enough to survive that violence. The shell flew through the air broadcasting a radio signal. When that signal bounced back from a nearby airplane, the fuse sensed it and triggered the explosive. The shell did not need to hit the plane, it just needed to get within 70 feet. At that distance, the explosion created a cloud of shrapnel that could tear apart any aircraft. The officer showed Kuwahara numbers. American factories were producing 40,000 of these fuses every single day. 40,000! The precision required to build each one was something Japan's entire industrial system couldn't match even once, and America was doing it 40,000 times a day. The officer explained that the fuse contained more than 200 separate parts, all of which had to work perfectly together while being small enough to fit inside a shell and tough enough to survive being fired from a cannon. Scientists, engineers, and factory workers had collaborated on the project, sharing information freely across universities, corporations, and military branches. Kuwahara thought about how Japan's military operated. Scientists worked in isolation, forbidden from talking to each other about their research. The Army and Navy refused to share technology with each other, each service hoarding its secrets. When Japanese engineers had a breakthrough, it stayed locked away instead of spreading to where it could do the most good. The officer kept talking, and each new piece of information hit Kuwahara like a physical blow. He learned about radar, about how American ships could see aircraft approaching from 100 miles away in total darkness. He learned about the Essex-class carriers, massive ships built in just 18 months each, faster than Japan could build a single destroyer. He learned about factories in Detroit that had switched from making cars to making bombers, producing one new aircraft every 63 minutes around the clock. He learned about something called the Manhattan Project, though the officer would not explain what it was, only that it represented American scientific capability at a level Japan could never approach. Every revelation deepened Kuwahara's understanding that the war had been unwinnable from the very beginning. Japan's leaders had talked endlessly about spirit and sacrifice, about how Japanese willpower would overcome American material advantages. It was all lies. Not intentional lies, perhaps, but lies born from refusing to face reality. Spirit could not stop a proximity fuse. Willingness to die meant nothing when the enemy could kill you before you got close enough to matter. In May, an American guard gave Kuwahara some magazines to read, including a technical journal from 1943. It was 2 years old, published before the proximity fuse had even been used in combat, and it contained an article about miniaturizing radar components. The article discussed the challenges openly, describing different approaches that various research teams were trying. Kuwahara stared at the pages in disbelief. This was public. American civilians could read about radar miniaturization in a magazine.
In Japan, radar was one of the most closely guarded military secrets. Scientists who worked on it were forbidden from publishing anything. The contrast revealed everything wrong with how Japan approached technology and war. America's open civilian scientific community, with universities and companies freely sharing ideas, had out-innovated Japan's militarized secrecy by such a wide margin that the two nations might as well have been fighting from different centuries. That night, Kuwahara lay on his bunk and thought about his friends. Takeshi, who loved poetry and wanted to be a teacher. Hiroshi, who made everyone laugh even when rations were short and training was brutal. Kenji, who cried quietly the night before his final mission but climbed into his plane anyway because the emperor had commanded it. All of them died. Not killed by American cruelty or superior courage, but by Japanese stupidity. By leaders who sent young men to die rather than admit that Japan could not win a technological war against an industrial giant. The proximity fuse was not really a weapon, Kuwahara realized. It was a mirror. It showed Japan exactly what it was. A nation that had tried to fight the 20th century with 19th century thinking, that had valued obedience over innovation, secrecy over collaboration, and sacrifice over effectiveness.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Kuwahara found paper and a pencil and began writing, not to send to anyone, but simply to organize his thoughts. He wrote that 4,600 kamikaze pilots had died in 6 months, killed by proximity fuses. He wrote that each of those deaths had been meaningless, not because the pilots lacked courage, but because their courage had been spent fighting an enemy they could not reach. He wrote that wars were won in laboratories and factories, not in pilots' hearts. He wrote that Japan had lost the war the moment it started, because winning would have required a completely different kind of nation, one that valued scientists as much as soldiers, that encouraged questions instead of demanding obedience, that measured strength by the ability to solve problems instead of the willingness to die. When he finished writing, Kuwahara folded the paper carefully and kept it. Someday, he thought, Japan would need to understand these lessons. Someday, if his country was going to survive and rebuild, it would need to remember why the kamikazes failed and what that failure meant about the kind of nation Japan needed to become. Kuwahara stepped off the ship at Yokohama in September 1946, more than a year after the war had ended. The dock was crowded with other returning prisoners and soldiers, all of them thin and exhausted, all of them staring at what remained of their country. The city he remembered was gone. In its place stood acre after acre of flattened ruins, broken concrete and twisted metal stretching as far as he could see. A few buildings still stood, their walls blackened by fire, their windows empty like the eyes of skulls. People moved through the rubble like ghosts, searching for anything useful, anything that could be sold or eaten or burned for warmth. Women in patched clothing carried bundles on their backs. Children with stick-thin arms and legs picked through debris. An old man pushed a cart loaded with salvaged wood, his face empty of expression. This was what losing looked like. This was what happened when a nation's leaders refused to face reality until reality burned their cities to ash. Kuwahara took a train toward his home village, or what he hoped was still his home village. The train car was packed with people, all of them silent, all of them looking out the windows at the devastation rolling past. He saw factories reduced to skeletal frames, their machinery looted or destroyed. He saw rice fields turned into graveyards, each one marked with thousands of wooden posts. He saw a shrine that had stood for 300 years now collapsed into rubble, its sacred gate lying broken in the dirt. Every kilometer of the journey reinforced what he had learned in the prison camp. Japan had fought a war it could never win. The proximity fuse was just one weapon among thousands, one example of American industrial and scientific power that Japan could not match. The firebombing of Tokyo, which killed more people in a single night than the Great Earthquake of 1923, had been carried out by bombers that Japan could not shoot down in sufficient numbers. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented physics that Japanese scientists understood in theory but could never have built, not with Japan's limited industrial capacity and isolation from international scientific collaboration. The physical destruction surrounding him was the inevitable result of the technological gap he had witnessed through the proximity fuse. His family's home was still standing, though the roof had been patched with salvaged metal and one wall showed cracks from bomb blast concussion. His mother answered his knock and stood frozen for a moment before pulling him inside with tears streaming down her face. His father, thinner than Kuwahara remembered and bent with exhaustion, embraced him without speaking. His younger sister, now nearly grown, clung to his arm. They had received word that he was alive and coming home, but seeing him in person made it real. That night, over a small meal of rice and pickled vegetables that represented most of what the family had, Kuwahara told them about his time in America. He described the prisoner of war camp, the food, the treatment, and most importantly, the proximity fuse and what it represented. His father listened carefully, his face growing more troubled as Kuwahara explained how American openness and industrial collaboration had created weapons Japan never knew existed. When Kuwahara finished, his father was quiet for a long time. Then he said that during the final year of the war, the military had come through the village, demanding everything. They took metal gates for scrap. They took the temple bell to melt down for ammunition. They took young boys barely old enough to hold rifles and sent them south, and none of those boys came home. The village leaders had known the war was lost, his father said, but no one could say it out loud. To question victory was to question the emperor, and to question the emperor was treason. So everyone had kept quiet and pretended to believe, even as American planes flew overhead unopposed, even as the rice rations shrank to nothing, even as the government urged civilians to sharpen bamboo spears to fight the coming invasion. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon that killed kamikazes, Kuwahara realized. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Japan's entire approach to the war and to modernity itself. In the weeks after his return, Kuwahara walked through the ruins of nearby Hiroshima. The city had been destroyed by a single bomb, something that should have been impossible but was now undeniable. At ground zero, shadows of people were burned into concrete, the only remaining trace of human beings who had been vaporized in an instant. The bomb had released as much energy as 20,000 tons of dynamite, all from a device small enough to fit in a single aircraft. Kuwahara stood in the wasteland and understood that the atomic bomb and the proximity fuse came from the same source. They were both products of a society that valued scientific inquiry, that allowed engineers and physicists to collaborate freely, that could mobilize massive industrial resources to technological goals. Japan had fought that society with bamboo spears and suicide attacks. The outcome had been inevitable.
Kuwahara carried two things from his time in America. The first was a schematic diagram of the proximity fuse that an American engineer had given him during his final days in the prison camp. The engineer had said it was a gift, a way to help Japan understand what it needed to learn. The second thing was harder to describe. It was a mental framework, a new way of understanding how nations became powerful and how wars were really won. Japan would have to rebuild completely, and it would have to rebuild on principles very different from those that had led to the war. The Bushido Code and the cult of sacrifice had failed. What Japan needed now was exactly what America had demonstrated: open scientific communities, industrial efficiency, civilian and military cooperation, and above all, the humility to learn from defeat. Over the next few years, as Japan began its long reconstruction under American occupation, Kuwahara watched former soldiers and kamikaze pilots make choices about their futures. Many of them, like him, turned to engineering and science. They enrolled in rebuilt universities and studied with an intensity born from understanding exactly how far behind Japan had fallen. The proximity fuse became a teaching tool in these classrooms. Professors used it to illustrate the importance of collaboration, precision manufacturing, and applied physics. They told students that America had developed the fuse in just 3 years, going from initial concept to mass production faster than Japan had gone from recognizing the need for radar to building a single working prototype. The lesson was clear. Japan's post-war survival depended on building the kind of scientific and industrial culture that could have prevented the war in the first place. By the 1960s, Japan's transformation was visible everywhere. Factories that had once produced Zeros now made transistor radios, televisions, and cameras. Engineers who had designed kamikaze aircraft now designed bullet trains. The same national energy that had been channeled into suicide attacks was now channeled into quality control, manufacturing efficiency, and technological innovation. Companies like Sony, Honda, and Toyota became global leaders by applying the lessons that defeat had taught. They emphasized collaboration over hierarchy, continuous improvement over rigid tradition, and practical results over abstract ideals. The kamikaze's sacrifice, which had been militarily meaningless, was given new meaning through Japan's determination never to repeat the mistakes that had made that sacrifice necessary. In 1975, Kuwahara stood before a classroom at Tokyo University of Technology. He was 60 years old now, a professor of engineering, and the students looking up at him had been born after the war ended. They knew the war only from textbooks and their grandparents' stories. Behind Kuwahara, a slide projector showed the internal circuitry of a proximity fuse. He had given this lecture many times, but it never stopped feeling important. He began by telling the students that 30 years earlier, 4,600 of his fellow pilots had died in just 6 months. They had not died from lack of courage. They had died because Japan's leaders valued ideology over reality, because Japan's military culture discouraged the kind of open scientific collaboration that produced weapons like the proximity fuse, and because Japan's industrial base could not match American manufacturing capability. Each proximity fuse that killed a kamikaze represented a system that empowered scientists, engineers, and factory workers to innovate freely. The kamikazes died because Japanese society had subordinated all of those people to military dogma and nationalist rhetoric. Kuwahara told his students that they were responsible for making sure Japan never made those mistakes again. Technology is not separate from values, he said. The proximity fuse existed because American society created an environment where scientists could question assumptions, where engineers from different companies could share solutions, where factory workers were trained to high levels of skill and given the tools they needed. Japan's post-war success came from learning those lessons and applying them. The transistor radios and bullet trains that made Japan prosperous were built on the same principles that had built the proximity fuse: collaboration, precision, continuous improvement, and respect for expertise. The students needed to understand that honoring the kamikaze's sacrifice meant refusing to repeat the thinking that had made that sacrifice necessary. It meant building a Japan where young people's talents were developed rather than thrown away, where scientific truth mattered more than comforting lies, where the nation measured its strength not by willingness to die, but by capacity to solve problems and create value. Kuwahara turned off the projector and looked at his students. The classroom was silent. He said that the proximity fuse had ended the kamikaze attacks by making sacrifice meaningless. Let that be the last time, he told them, that Japan's youth died for leaders who refused to face reality. Let that be the last time that Japan fought the future with the past. The war had been lost in American laboratories and factories long before the first kamikaze took off. Japan had won its post-war recovery in rebuilt universities and modern factories by learning from that defeat. The students sitting before him represented Japan's future. Whether that future would be prosperous and peaceful depended on whether they remembered what the proximity fuse had taught. That in the modern world, nations survive and thrive through innovation, collaboration, and the courage to question their own assumptions. The kamikaze had been brave, but bravery without wisdom was waste. 4,600 young men had learned that lesson too late. Japan's post-war generation had the responsibility to remember it forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.